let me just get right down to it. I think it will help to understand sort of what these companies are and what they do before we start getting into a discussion of some of the questions we have for them. But Craig, if perhaps you could start, and I suspect everybody in this room has dealt with Experian one way or the other, but a little bit about how you see your opportunities and challenges, a little bit about your business.
Great, well, thank you very much. Yeah, Experian, I suppose, unlike companies like Kodak, doesn't necessarily have such a well-known brand. I did think, in case you get distracted, I have some Experian socks on today. That was the best branding I could manage to find to bring with me. Thanks to my colleagues that sent me off with those. So most of you probably know Experian as a credit bureau. People involved in credit checking, making sure that you're a reliable risk on whether a bank decides to give you a credit card, something like that, or a mortgage. That's probably how we're best known. Actually, if you step back and really understand our company, let me give you a few pointers about us. We perform a role in society as arguably the largest global information services company out there in helping all sorts of journeys in your life be operated more effectively. That might be getting a car. Is it a good idea for a bank to give you an automotive loan or a leasing company to do that? Is it a safe and responsible risk, and are you able to get the best product with the best interest rates? It might be sending a child to college and all of the saving and financial preparation you need to do that. It might be whether you're going to get a mortgage to buy a home. Or it might be for a company, you want to market your brand differently, connect and understand who the right target segments for your clients are. It might be that you feel, as everybody should be, that your business is at risk of fraud, or as an individual, you're at risk of identity theft and you want to protect yourself from those criminal acts. Our business, at its absolute core, takes data and information, turns it into insights, helps people, be those individuals, small businesses, large businesses, or government institutions, make smarter decisions with that information.
Andy?
Rockwell Collins. First of all, I think we ought to recognize what a wonderful conference this is. And I just want to tell you that when Vijay first started this, we had no idea where it would go. And look how successful it's become. I think we ought to give him a round of applause and just thank him for this great success. Yeah, let me say just a few words about Rockwell Collins. How many of you know the company Rockwell Collins, know what they do? Okay, let me ask that question a little differently. How many of you have flown on an airplane recently? Okay, very good. So if you've flown on one of Boeing's most recent fleet, very high probability that the flight controls on that airplane were designed and manufactured by Rockwell Collins. If you're on an Airbus plane, very high probability that there's some equipment, navigational equipment, communication systems, or the flight controls on that Airbus plane. Also the same would be true of the regional jets by Bombardier and Embraer. So Rockwell Collins is a world leader in avionics, and it does about half of its business is on the commercial side, half of it's on the defense side. So Sikorsky helicopters on the defense side, head-up displays on the jet fighter planes, and equipment of that sort. Very recently, we purchased a company you may have read about in the Wall Street Journal called BE Aviation. BE Aviation is the world leader in designing seats on airplanes. So they do most of the seats on all the planes that you fly. So Rockwell Collins now has the pilot area on the plane, the pilot cabin, as well as the passenger cabin on the plane, and a very nice consistency of the supply chain and the customer base through both of those businesses. In total, about an $8.5 billion revenue business going forward.
So can you make those seats a little more comfortable, please?
So I was just going to say that please don't complain yet about the seats. If you don't like them, I just joined the board. Give me some time.
Greg?
Ex-CEO at Ingram Micro, which has brought and continues to bring technology solutions in a B2B context. Was at the company for 15 years. But having left the company about 4 or 5 years ago, I've been very active on some other boards. So let me just spend a bit of time more so on MGM, because I think most people can relate to that company here, given it's based in Vegas. So this is in a company that's all about personal experiences. So you go in there into that property or in that environment, you are essentially being inundated with visual experiences, bedroom experiences, wherever that may take you, right through to entertainment that we were talking before. So it's all about content in a visitation context. 40,000 rooms in Vegas. A lot of people don't realize they got 10 major properties there with very different systems and tools. It's a combination of many different acquisitions of these properties. So there's challenges in terms of their go-to-market there. And there's a changing population expectation of how to use tools to book rooms, to make decisions on what games you want to play, or to go to whatever entertainment venue that you're interested in. So that full experience and bringing that in together. And again, the operation is also expanding very aggressively in Asia and throughout the rest of the US by bringing other properties forward. So a lot of challenges, good challenges of growth and remaining relevant with a changing population and expectations of how they go ahead and book things. So a digital challenge might be Expedia being very good at what they do in booking all sorts of traffic and bringing traffic as an aggregator. Does that traffic come to this property versus other property choices? And then, of course, they have to compete against that as a direct marketer as well as an agent of using a lot of other digital tools.
So let's play with that idea a little bit longer, because I think that's ultimately what this conference is about. When we heard from Target, I mean, they're under a lot of attack from obviously Amazon and Walmart, which was the market leader for so many years, and I highlighted Kmart didn't keep up. And then you talk about what's going on with Warner Brothers or Ticketmaster. I never thought of them as the company that is sort of the unpleasant experience between you and the concert, but that was sort of interesting. And so on. And of course, you heard sort of the fantastic story of, and I went to grad school at the University of Rochester, so that was a personal story for me as well. But Kodak obviously had some very serious senior management challenges around capabilities, around direction, and around how they defined adjacencies. So I want to sort of ask Craig this question. Sort of just like, who's your competition? Because we read, and what are you doing about it? In the sense of, we read that there's so many different ways to predict credit risk these days based on a variety of data sets, not just the ones you have, perhaps.
Well, I suppose our business is very diverse, and so we have an interesting situation where, and I'll come back to that in a second, where we have a lot of different competition. So in our consumer businesses, where you might know our properties as freecreditreport.com, freecreditscore.com, or Experian.com, we would compete with Credit Karma is probably the most well-known of the competitors we have out there. Or in identity protection, we would compete with LifeLock. Those kind of peoples would be some of our traditional consumer competition. In the business world, there are 3 big national credit reporting agencies, Experian the largest, and then Equifax and TransUnion. So we would compete with those companies. But we have all sorts of different adjacencies. So we have a large business in software, in helping automate the way that financial institutions are able to work through decisions. There we might compete with FICO, we might compete with some of the large systems integrators. So there are all sorts of different competition there. We have workflow systems into 60% of the largest hospitals in the US. And that's about helping take the data and information that we have and make sure that people are able to make smart decisions on the right kind of payment plan, that hospitals are able to make those right choices. Again, a different set of competition there. We use our data and information to help online advertisers describe market segments. That might be you want to place digital banner ads on Facebook, or that might be you want to place adverts on real-time streaming television. We have different competition there again. You might think that's a lot of different segments of competition. Of course, it's not really accidental. Actually, it's the other way around. It is know what your core competence is, and I thought the professor before spoke very eloquently about the importance to find ways to diversify into adjacencies. So that's what we do. We look and we say, okay, we know that we have this business here and it's a great business, but every business will inevitably go through a cycle. What's our core competency? Our competency is being a big data company. What are the other things that we can do with that? And so we move into adjacencies all of the time. We're constantly expanding and shifting the focus. And so that changes the competition that we face. Kind of big point number one, as you go into this just totally different world and speed of competition, always assume that business models are only finite. And if you're never ahead of the diversification, then you're not going fast enough. So that would be a kind of big message I'd give to everybody. Number one would be that. That's why we have so many different competition. And sometimes know that the competition will behave in a very different way. They might have a different ownership structure that means that profit is a nice, interesting concept for some point 10 years down the line. I don't really like businesses like that, but there seem to be plenty of those out there at the moment. We can argue at a different day as to whether we're heading for another dot-com correction, but that's one for another day. And that is, pick your fight, pick it carefully, and go hard and fast at it. And so there are some of our competition where we are taking a fight directly to them. Different strategies, different places.
And actually, Experian deserves a lot of credit because they converted from a transaction processing company to a big data and analytics company, I think probably before all of your competitors. We used to cite Experian as an example of why we needed to focus more on analytics and big data in our MBA program. They didn't know we were doing it, but we were doing it. So, Andy, what about you at Rockwell Collins? So you seem to have adopted sort of an interesting adjacency of seats, but on a digital front.
But on the digital front, I think Craig said, and you said this earlier, I thought that little story told from the New York Times was so compelling. Because I think in any organization, any company today, whether you're talking about our aeronautics industry or whether it's in the credit industry or the entertainment industry, if you're comfortable with where you are with technology, you are really in trouble. And that's the way we view this. We are never comfortable as a board at Rockwell Collins. We have multi-layers of investigation, analysis of our competitors, what they're up to, what they're doing, where there might be holes in our technology set, where we think the next innovation is going to come from. I might describe for a minute what those multi-layers are. First of all, we have an external group of advisors. These are the leading researchers in academia on aeronautical engineering, plus some individuals from the defense industry, plus a 5-star general. And we meet with them, the company, not the board, but the company meets with them 3-4 times a year to gain information on where the forefront is in all of the areas of our product line. They provide input to our leading engineers at Rockwell Collins. Those are the engineers who are looking at every single product by every single one of our competitors, disentangling the mysteries of those products, thinking about where we're lagging, where we need to move ahead, looking at the holes in our product line. We then do something which very few boards do. Most boards do not have a technology committee. We do. We have a technology committee, and most boards have, the audit committee, the comp committee, the governance committee. They all have fiduciary responsibility, but this technology committee is very critical to us at Rockwell Collins, and they meet at every board meeting. They meet during the day of the board meeting. The committee is open to the entire board, which is quite unusual. Almost every board member at every one of those technology committee meetings is there. And here we are listening to what's taking place at the forefront. We want to know as a board where the holes are, and then we have to make those decisions. Do we buy that technology, or do we create it organically? And we have a separate committee, our Corporate and Finance Strategy Committee, that takes a look at the financial side of any new investment we're going to make in technology. The other thing we do is that we actually, as a board, go to our technology centers, where we're designing, where we're manufacturing these new products. And so, for example, I have flown a 787, the Dreamliner Boeing, when we were creating the flight controls. I landed it beautifully. Thank you very much. My mentor told me that even any drink would not have spilled. I was wonderful. I did not have the same luck in the cockpit of a Sikorsky helicopter. I crashed that several times. But that's a lot more difficult to do. But the point is that we are out there as a board understanding what that competitive set is at, where those points, those challenges are, and where we have to make investments as a company to keep pace.
So Greg, I'll make this question sort of complex in the sense of, from the challenges that you face at MGM, but also a lot of these decisions are clearly sort of CEO level and board level. And one of the challenges that keeps coming up in our research, and we hear it from our community all the time, is sort of the digital competence, for lack of a better word. And I have my own misgivings about that term because there's so many competencies that you need in businesses. But how do you put together this team when, particularly if you come from an old line business to a new line business? If you could tell a composite story across your various boards, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, and this is from a board perspective.
Yes.
Because there is an immediacy and a need there without question. I would say most boards now, and the 3 or 4 that I've been directly involved with, and even some of the smaller private companies I'm involved with, are clearly looking for the same sort of resource pool and are looking for some digital talent in that boardroom. And as we know, a lot of the deployment and expertise in the digital talent domain, I would say, rests with a younger audience of engineers, computer scientists, and a lot of that technology definition has been coming about over the last 10 to 15 years. And most board members tend to be dinosaurs, relatively speaking, in their 50s to 70 range is very typical of a board membership complement. So typically a board today would say, I'll need certain skills in financial skills, operational skills, but now there's more and more around technology deployment and being on the forefront of technology deployment and testing the management and also bringing different ideas to management. I would say there's more success at boards that I've seen where there's more operating people and a bigger percentage of operating people that are being exposed to a number of, let's say, different environments with digital tool sets that are in deployment, because they vary by industry, by sector,
Sure.
by problem, if you may. And it's more the operational understanding of the challenges of putting in something, testing it, and driving it through an organization and driving that change that is useful. So you hopefully get more operationally oriented people that have been involved in some degree of transformational change. It's rare that boards today will go out and pull a second line or a third line IT individual, which would have a lot of digital expertise, if you may, and bring that person to a board, largely because they feel they don't have enough either gravitas in the room with the other individuals, or they will not have seen the complexity of the issues that the board might be typically dealing with. And finally, I'd say to some extent, I've even heard management say, I don't think that's the right type of person to bring in because we've got that on our own organization. We've got that skill set internally. I want you to bring the diversity of understanding of the broader issues and the contacts or the relationships that can help me go chase a problem down. And as board members, we spend a lot of time helping individuals in the organization with ideas that we've either run across or other individuals that we know that can bring some expertise to the table quickly. And I'd say management teams really appreciate that. As a CEO, I depended on that quite extensively. And that's how a board should be used. It's not only just governance, it's also how do I improve the operations of the company based on what things you've run across. And I'd say with more operational experience, you have a slightly better chance of, let's say, tackling issues in the company and getting good guidance from the board.
Yeah, one of the strategies that I've seen that I have real mixed feelings about is some companies I've seen have appointed a Fortune 100 chief information officer and think that they've solved their digital competence problem.
Right.
And I honestly, privately will tell you, I look at that company and say, like, that company has really backward technology. And if you look at some of the sort of the more sophisticated, younger companies, they're sort of architecturally very, very different. But I want to turn it over to Craig, because you're in the information business and you've been there from the start of, I mean, you haven't been there, but experience been there from the beginning. And so on the one hand, sort of digital capabilities is native to you. You're as much of a digital native as there can be in the corporate sector. But I'm curious, but your competition, so I suspect your people are far more comfortable around this, but your competition is also far more intense. So how do you see sort of the acquisition of digital capabilities, both sort of in the executive ranks and at the board ranks? Because just a quick comment on, GE, for example, now wants every new employee to code. They're pairing all their senior executives with software, not to make them coders, but to get an understanding of the world they live in. So your thoughts on that?
I think, we're very lucky in all of Experian business all over the world. We've been involved in technology and the digital side of life since the very early creation of the company. Here in the US, one of the real founders of our business was Cy Ramo. And for those of you who know who Cy Ramo is, he sadly died about a year ago, but at 103, and was the R in TRW, Thomson Ramo Woolridge. And in the 60s was clever enough and smart enough to have the vision of the cashless society. The guy was a technologist through and through, and an incredible person. He was also one of the creators of the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Program. So, and arguably wrote one of the smartest essays on tennis and the mechanics of tennis ever. He couldn't play tennis, but was fascinated by it. And he instilled into the company, people like that, incredible. He instilled, I think, very early on into the company a sense of the fact that technology is part of how we work. And technology has moved on into the digital world. But But it's interesting. I was thinking a lot about this kind of question as it comes to a conference like this. We don't have that sense where, well, technology is something that the technology team over there does. It's sort of like we don't have the sense that strategy is something that the strategy department does rather than the CEO does. So the expectation on everybody to understand and connect with the digital world is extremely high. We don't insist that everybody can code.
Sure.
You know, we could do some Python tests, I suppose, as we recruit senior executives to add to the batch of other things that we end up doing, but I'm not sure that's quite what we mean. But we do find that from our board down, we don't have a separate technology committee, but I know all of our board members are both experienced in technology, have operated in somewhere in the application of technology rather than pure play technology organizations, and are able to challenge, like Greg said, and bring that smarts and interest into the organization. For recruitment, it's essential. So that there is no sense that we can recruit somebody who would say, well, I don't really know anything about technology. That's what the technology people do. It would be like somebody joining our business saying, well, I'm not really very interested in data. We're like, well, yeah, but that's it, right? That's the whole game. So you're not very interested in data and you don't really get data science, you're probably not in the right place. It's fascinating to watch how that goes. It just cuts to the core of our company. Our people are very performance driven. There are some experienced people in the audience, and they'll tell you this if you come and spend time with our organization. It's a very, very performance driven company, and so everybody has a high level of financial understanding. But you will hear people talk about the level of their technology debt as well when they talk about the rest of their financial information. It becomes part of the financial conversation that we have in how we operate the business. So it kind of cuts to the core of who the company is and how we operate, and the way we think about the marketplaces. So we approach every problem thinking, okay, this customer, consumer, part of the government, sector of industry has this issue or is going to have this issue. What do we know about it? How could we apply our information and insight that we've got to help them address and solve that problem? By the way, subtext to solving that problem will always be a digital interaction. And so it's just, very difficult to explain, it's just how we are.
Right. And what's interesting there is when you talk to the CIO community, which I spent a lot of time with, and I'm not talking about Experian now, but you actually don't hear the same story, which is they don't feel that their voices are heard. The New York Times is a classic example of that. So one of the things that we just read was a survey of top executives done by a big consulting firm, and they said, well, the investment and leadership commitment are trending upward as digital. So the boards and the C-suites are getting it, but their confidence in the organizational abilities is dropping. And I'm surprising you with this finding a little bit, but how would you interpret that? That is, sort of the more senior you are, you begin to see the world is shifting, you're making the right sort of moves, but you're less confident about your company's capabilities to pull that off.
I mean, I don't feel like that about our
That's
company.
good. Adam, you must be very happy.
But I don't feel about it because we're pretty obsessive about the point. We're pretty obsessive about the point, which is we've always got to be ahead. And so there are lots of different ways of being ahead. You look at it in how you recruit and bring in senior executives. But also, let's be frank, we have consumer business, and so we want to be thinking a lot about user interface design. Yes, we need a different demographic of people. Sure. We took last year some students from high schools, over the summer vacation to help us work on user interface design, because 17 and 18-year-olds with a combination of design and math skills and some IT skills are pretty valuable people in that, right? So, it could be that example, or it could be right up through the, through the way we engage with our customers and our consumers all of the time. And I could understand how other organizations might feel like that, which is, hey, management suddenly woke up and realized there's this thing called digital out there somewhere, and recruited some board members and got a really high-powered CIO and looked down the organization and thought, oh gosh, we haven't been running the company like that. You could understand how that would happen. I think, we're fortunate, unfortunate on this issue, whichever way you want to put it, which is it's a permanent obsession in our company.
Greg?
Yeah, I would say most companies feel some degree of pressure to be improving on their digital front, no matter how you look at it. And we're being measured more on that today than we ever have been. And if you see one other competitor or a number of competitors in your core business or your adjacent space potentially growing a little bit better or having an interesting offering, there's a tendency, of course, to think it's better over there. And there's also a tendency, I think, in a lot of organizations, even though the message might be right at the top, we've got more trouble. We're pedaling much harder to advance than anybody else, which is when you go to the next company, it's got the same set of challenges, but you're not obviously showing that externally. So I think internally, a lot of people say, we're still way behind. We've got a lot to do. And some of that is true. With the changing business paradigms, you cannot rest on your laurels, as Craig is saying. You really have to keep pushing the envelope and saying to yourself, how is my organization going to react quicker and have some punch to it and take some risks? And a lot of organizations are slow on that risk front. They'll take small ones. They won't place the big bets. They won't get the board to support those big bets, and that can be problematic. And that's how some, like the Kodak story, it probably wasn't enough pushing through that organization with those big bets in a longer
So
point
if
of view.
you could prepare some questions, I have one question, then I'm going to turn it over to you, and the runners can get ready. So since you brought up Kodak, and I wasn't planning to ask this, I assume all of you heard the Kodak story. I'm curious to hear about sort of your take on the Kodak story, like with hindsight, or what could have been done differently. Because it doesn't even have to be Kodak, because Target's facing this. They're not making enough money in digital. They're still making money in stores. We hear this with sort of Warner Brothers. Everybody's got sort of some version of cannibalization. So the broader question is, how do you, at the levels that you guys are at in organizations, deal with sort of, somebody said it to me in a very interesting way, trading off analog dollars for digital pennies.
Well,
how do you deal with that?
Yeah, as Craig mentioned, not Craig, sorry, as Willie mentioned before, there's usually a cash cow in a business of some sort, but there has to be an investment pool. As you see market dynamics changing, you've got to be putting significant amount of money into the investment side of the equation. Many companies go down a path of M&A or saying, I need to buy that competency, and hopefully I can bring that through the organization, and it can change the trajectory of the organization. It doesn't always work, as we all know, but that is one path. But I think there has to be a significant commitment to substantial change with a different structure, a different division, and essentially what a lot of executives will say, you got to eat your young.
Right.
You really have got to make a change that just says, we're going to milk this piece of the business down because we have to compete in a different environment. Not everybody steps up to that. It's very difficult to do. The inertia in a lot of companies just gets in the way.
Andy?
Yes, and just to build on what Greg just said, on both of the boards that I'm on Badger Meter and in Rockwell Collins, when we have had disruptors come into the space, what we have felt is we obviously have to have the cash coming in from the core business, but to deal with the disruptor, we want to set up a separate Skunk Works, a separate business that we're funding, we're investing in, so that you don't have the competition taking place directly between these two units. And in one case in Badger Meter, when we realized we do water meters at Badger Meter, but the whole business of water meters is how you read the meter. And it used to be 20 years ago, all of these meters were read by someone coming by your house. Then 10 years ago, it was a radio sending a signal, and today it's done by wireless technology through a cellular network. And the first water meter company to develop that technology was Badger Meter. And the way we did it was by going to Silicon Valley and buying a company that had the ability and the skill level to actually develop that technology. And that was just 3 years ago, and today there are 750,000 meters in the United States that are using that technology. That's how quickly that market has moved. But we could never have done that if we tried to do it in the core business. It was an investment made, a skunk business off to the side, and we're utilizing that group of software designers to do a lot more today than they even did when they first came into the business.
Great.
I think the last 5 to 7 years tells us organizations that believe that, and this is a little bit of a contrary position, but tells us creating an old code, new code structure is the way to handle this. I'm not sure that I agree. I think that this has been a very, very common way for organizations, and some have had great success. I think Greg's right. Multi-layer approach to inorganic growth is very, very important. Our approach takes 3 levels. One is venture stage investment, which is early stage investment in case something pans out. 2 is minority investment, we're more certain about this, but we'd prefer a longer-term bet on it. We prefer not to commit now. And the third is outright acquisition, which we play in all three things. But the expectation of there's a cash cow over here, and it's got to fund the growth of this thing over here, and eventually you're going to pivot at some stage. It doesn't work for me in the way that we run our organization. We run it differently, which is to say, first of all, as a professor said before, concentrate on adjacencies. Mm-hmm. But we put that expectation back onto the leaders of the cash cows to do it too. And so we say, you are in charge of creating your own future. Your future is not going to be the same as it is today. If you can't cope with that, you're not right for us. Now, you have to cope with generating the cash and be placing all of these bets. And if you're not placing bets in our 3 lines of inorganic growth, and you're not placing bets in adjacencies, and you're not placing bets in cannibalizing your own business but creating something else that you can pivot to, you're not going to succeed.
Right.
And so it pushes through the organization in a different way that says, we don't want a new co and an old co, and the old co is going to create the cash, take care of the EPS equation for a few years, and the new co is going to take it differently. This takes a lot of difficult management with external shareholders. And the one thing we haven't really touched on, but given the level of this debate that you asked for, is important, at least for public companies, to manage their investor base carefully through this. And I'm sure all of us as board members can understand just how difficult that is in a world of quarterly earnings and drive for EPS and straight up comparisons. You have to set a long-term framework of capital allocation against that they buy into and accept. And if you can do that, great. If you can't, you really got to work at it.
So can I just say, so I don't disagree with what you just said. What I meant was that this group had a very different culture, and they needed to design all the software, but the business leaders were overseeing this, right, so that they were investing in the business, so that eventually it came together. But the design was being done in a very different culture from the original organization.
But this point that you raised about sort of spending time with sort of Wall Street or shareholders is huge, because an example that I like to use is when Disney spent $1 billion on My Magic Plus, the whole band program. Shareholders were upset, the stock market analysts were upset, but it turned out to be a very sort of productive investment, to say the least. And so there's a big piece here about the narrative that you share, because these returns are highly uncertain. Right. In fact, the new trend in valuation finance is actually the narrative you tell around some of these startups, because people have to believe your story. They're all losing money, to your point. And you still have the question of what's the right valuation. But with that, let me just, there's a question over there. Go ahead.
Thanks, gentlemen. That was great. I'm Alan Fazio. I'm the CIO for Word & Brown. And as a CIO, I'm so excited about boards creating technology subcommittees, so I have a new constituent to disappoint. Outside of my current ones. So my question for all three of you is this. As you've grown in your careers and technology has become more important, how has your role changed in helping your CIO be successful versus maybe earlier in your career?
I'll take a first crack. I would say, again, as you grow in your business, you start realizing the major drivers of the business, you understand them better. And working with the CIO, you say there's 2 or 3 things we have to continue to outperform the market on, and you've got to be constantly monitoring that need for your company. I'll pick on an Ingram here. We were always looking for the next new pieces of technology that were going to make a difference in the market, and we're going to have an incredible acceleration. So we had to align our business around those opportunities. So understanding what the business really needs with the CIO and working closely with that CIO is absolutely germane to the success of the company. Has that changed immensely? I wouldn't say so. It's just accelerated the conversations and the discussions of the business unit leaders or program leaders or content leaders with the CIO organization, so to make sure that we're in lockstep to deploy as quickly as possible. The day of big deployments, I think, are pretty scary in many companies around digital transformation. Is more bite-size, test it, and then deploy quickly through the rest of the organization. Otherwise, you can bog a company down by the big bets.
Let me sort of, there's a question I absolutely want to get to because I think it's the elephant in the room, which is cybersecurity.
Yeah.
With the Russian hacking of the DNC, with sort of the Spanish techniques being sort of hacked, and all the CIA stuff is now out there supposedly for public consumption. It's on everybody's mind, and of course, many of us have been victims of identity theft and things like that. So I'm just curious. Let's start with Craig here, because you're in the business of protecting my data. Actually, Craig helped me solve my identity theft problem, but though I think my socks will give his socks a run for the money. But more
I'm going to get some
seriously,
experience socks now.
more seriously, so sort of what do you got? What are all three of you doing? I'll start with you on cybersecurity.
Hard to get more serious than socks, but I get your point. It has to become something that becomes part of everybody's jobs. And so we operate, like many other organizations, we operate a three-line of defense model in our organization, and we apply that to both governance, compliance, risk, and also to security. And so it probably has changed a lot in even the last 5 years, certainly the last 10 years, where security was the purview of the security department. Mm-hmm. Then it was the purview of the IT department. Now it's the purview of the first-line operators of the business. You operate the business, you're accountable for the financial performance and the security of the business, and there's never any question that those investments you need to make are not optional. You have to keep investing, you have to keep ahead, you have to, as I think Andy did a great job talking about their way of keeping expertise into the organization, you have to have the best. You have to have the best advisors, the best external support, the best forensics. You have to have the best, employees in the company, but you have to train everybody. And I mean everybody. And it has to be constant, and the pressure has to be there, and it has to be just a part of how you run the business. And that's how you have to do it. For individuals, for all of us, we have to, outside of work in our personal lives, take as many sensible steps as we can to protect our own identities. And when we suffer from identity theft, which most of us do, sometimes we know, sometimes we don't, we have to act swiftly, and always pleased we were there to help you, Vijay.
So before I get to you, just a quick show of hands. How many of you actually get mandated cybersecurity training in your companies? This is refreshing.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
everybody.
Andy?
Let me build on what Craig said, from a board perspective. So 4 or 5 years ago, when all the hacking was going on, we were all reading about it, the board became very concerned at Rockwell Collins about, not that we weren't before, we always do a risk assessment, cybersecurity we've been doing forever, but became even more concerned because we have some very, very delicate classified information, obviously working for the defense industry. So we're concerned about how we're protecting our IP, of course the personal information, and then also all of the products that we produce that go into the field that are connected. And how we assure that those products won't be hacked once they're deployed. And so the board started to talk about how can we do a better job as a board of overseeing the risk. Now, still playing the board role. And we're not getting down into the weeds here, where the board members are responsible for what's going on day to day. Back to Greg's point a few minutes ago, we discussed, do we need a board member who has more expertise? We decided no. That's not the board's role, right? The board's role is to make sure that we have the appropriate protection, the appropriate detection, the appropriate reaction if we see a problem, that those systems are taking place at the right levels inside of the company, and that we have the right controls around those systems. And so that's our board role. To learn more about it, though, the board asked that management set up an exercise for us to be educated about what the risks are and what the board's role could be. And at one of our board meetings, we took a 2-hour session with 3 experts, a former FBI agent expertise, and 2 others who had expertise on cybersecurity. And so we learned a lot about what was taking place. Then we decided, where should this oversight of the risk we were facing, where should that be overseen? Which place on our board? What committee? Now, most companies will do it either as a committee of the whole of the board, or they may do it as part of the audit committee's responsibility. I sit on the audit committee. We do a risk assessment at least once a year of all the risks that the company is facing. We analyze how we're mitigating those risks. We take a look at the top 10 risks that the company is facing and how we're dealing with it. We have so much to do on the audit committee that we decided we could not provide enough focus on cybersecurity and the risk we might be facing. And therefore, we added it to the Technology Committee. So we now have the Cybersecurity and Technology Committee, which again meets quarterly, and it's open to the entire board. And at those meetings, every meeting, we have a much closer relationship with the CIO now, because the CIO is at each one of those meetings, and we're talking to the folks in the organization who've actually developed and are overseeing those systems. And then the board gets a full report, both from that committee and from the audit committee who's looking at those risks from a slightly different perspective.
So Greg, you got the last word here, which is, I'm going to switch the question on you. What is the one key takeaway that you would like our audience to remember?
There's so many things in this world. We've talked a lot about today software and the importance of that influencing everything we're doing. I think my exposure and experience in the companies, plus what Ingram does, is that people will spend a fair bit of money on software and think that that individual solution will take care of the issue in their business. But in fact, that's probably only 1/5 or 1/10 of the expense. There's still a whole ecosystem around hardware, processes, training, deployment that really are part of that whole transformation initiative of digital transformation. And so, yes, the software is important. It's fundamental. It's a platform, but there's so much you're
Absolutely.
still building around that business, and don't lose sight of that extra spend and effort.
Sure.
Rather than just think I got a simple solution here that it's going to take care of me, because that's what we've always found at Ingram. We would sell 7 or 8 different vendors to make a singular software solution work.
I'm actually
in a
going to take
business.
Chairman's prerogative and give Craig the last word. And
All
say,
right.
what, as a CEO,
So the one thing I'd ask all of you to take away from this session, at least, and the amazing insights you got from the other two gentlemen alongside me, is this: if you don't think your business has already been disrupted, you've missed it.
Yeah.
That's
I
the
think
one
you
thing I
should,
give.
I think you
good
should say
point.
that again. If you don't think your business has been disrupted, you already have been.
You've missed it. If
Ah,
you don't
missed
think
it.
there's disruption going on, you're under threat, you've been disrupted, you've not looked hard enough.
Well, let's thank this experienced and talented panel.